Welcome to the Thinking Abyss podcast, a philosophical journey through consciousness, reality, and the phenomena that challenge our understanding of existence. From ancient wisdom to cutting-edge theories, we explore where philosophy meets science and curiosity leads to the edge of the unknown.
Welcome. We are diving into a subject that is, well, utterly fundamental yet almost completely invisible. Language.
It really is.
It's like the architecture of our thoughts.
You're right.
You use it constantly, right?
Yeah.
But we rarely stop to consider that the actual mechanics of our words, the way we structure sentences, the vocabulary we have, might actually dictate the boundaries of what we can perceive, what we can even understand.
And that really is the central, profound question we are tackling today. It's not just about, the difference between English and French on the surface.
Right.
We are asking, does language merely clothe our thoughts after we've already had them? Like picking an outfit from a closet? Or does the linguistic system we inherit, the one we learn as children, does it fundamentally structure the operating system of the human mind itself?
So does it just reveal the world to us, or is it somehow creating the conceptual world we actually inhabit?
Precisely. That's the core tension, reveal or create.
Our mission today, then, is to explore this labyrinthine connection between these linguistic structures and our cognitive processes, how we think.
Yeah.
We're examining how grammar, vocabulary, these conceptual categories, how they quietly orchestrate not just what you think about, but actually how you think.
Looking for those invisible mechanisms deep inside your brain, that language might have installed years ago without you even noticing.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should probably start with the foundation, right? The classic and still pretty contentious idea of linguistic relativity.
The Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. You have to start there.
Yeah. This systematic investigation, it really kicked off in the early 20th century with two brilliant American linguists, Edward Sapir and his student, Benjamin Lee Whorf.
And their proposition was genuinely revolutionary, especially for Western thought at the time.
Which was?
That the deep structural differences between languages, not just surface vocabulary, but grammar, translate directly into significant differences in how people think, in cognition itself.
Before them, the common assumption was pretty much that everyone experiences the same objective reality, right?
Pretty much. Language was seen as just a flexible labeling system we slap onto that universal reality. Different labels, same world underneath.
But Whorf challenged this, especially after studying Native American languages.
He did. He felt that the grammatical requirements of a language, the things you have to specify, whether you want to or not, force speakers into habitual, unconscious ways of observing and reasoning about the world.
And the classic example, the centerpiece of this whole idea, is Whorf's work on the Hopi language.
Right. His famous observation, or claim, was that Hopi grammar lacked the kind of clear tenses that neatly distinguish past, present, and future for us.
The kind of linear time concepts that really define our reality in English. We line everything up.
Exactly. English creates this timeline, this progression of discrete moments, yesterday, today, tomorrow. Everything is sort of countable, like units on a ruler.
Or money, you could say.
Or money, yeah.
Sure.
Whorf argued that the Hopi language focused less on tense when the event occurred relative to now, and much more on aspect.
Aspect being, like the duration or the type of event. Is it ongoing, completed, potential?
Exactly. The quality of the event itself, its validity, its mode of being, rather than its position on a timeline.
So the Hopi could describe the process, the flow of something happening, but maybe not pin it down to a specific point on a linear clock, the way we obsessively do.
That was Whorf's argument. And the really radical conclusion he drew from this was that because their grammar lacked these obligatory linear tenses, Hopi speakers actually constructed a fundamentally different mental model of time.
Not just described it differently, but experienced it differently.
Yes. He proposed they experience time as a more fluid, cyclical thing, rooted in duration, preparation, the unfolding of events, rather than our infinitely divisible series of points on a line. He insisted this wasn't just a descriptive difference, it was an experiential difference. It fundamentally altered how they perceived temporal reality.
Wow. But hang on, didn't this initial really strong claim about Hopi time face some pretty massive criticism later on?
Decades later.
Oh, absolutely. Because if that's true, what he first argued, that sounds like linguistic determinism, the really strong version of the hypothesis.
It is linguistic determinism. The idea that language completely determines thought, that the boundaries of our language are literally the boundaries of our world.
And that's the version that's mostly been rejected, right?
Yeah. By and large, yes. Modern cognitive science finds it too strong, too absolute. Critics like Steven Pinker, for instance, pointed out that while Hopi certainly lacks the specific tense system of Indo-European languages, it absolutely does have complex grammatical and lexical mechanisms, markers, vocabulary to talk about duration, sequence, prediction, memory.
So the Hopi weren't living in some timeless void.
Not at all. The problem was likely, partly, Whorf trying to map a non-Western linguistic system onto a Western grammatical framework. He maybe overinterpreted the differences based on what he was expecting not to find.
Okay, so the strong version gets dialed back. But that didn't kill the whole idea, did it?
Not at all. It led to the modern consensus shifting towards the weaker, but actually much more powerful and crucially testable version, linguistic relativity.
Which says?
Language doesn't strictly determine thought, making certain thoughts impossible. But it significantly influences thought. It creates powerful tendencies, biases, grooves in how we perceive and categorize our experience.
It gives us cognitive preferences, maybe? Makes certain ways of thinking easier or more habitual?
Exactly. It shapes attention and habitual patterns of analysis.
And we can actually see this influence, this weaker influence, quite clearly in experiments, right? Especially around basic categorization, like color.
Yes, color perception is a fantastic test case because scientists initially assumed it was purely biological, universal, but language plays a role.
So tell us about the Himba people of Namibia. I understand researchers looked at how their language carves up the color spectrum.
They did. And it turns out their vocabulary categorizes colors quite differently from English speakers. It's not just that they have different words. The boundaries between the colors their words represent are shifted.
Okay, how so?
Well, for example, they often have a single broad category, the word buru, that covers many shades we would call blue, but also many shades we would call green, and even some darker colors.
So blue and green get lumped together sometimes.
Under that one term, yes. But, crucially, they also have multiple distinct words for different shades within the green-yellow range, words like Sarandu and Dambu, that English speakers tend to just lump together under the single category green.
Okay, different categories. So how does that influence their thought or perception? How do you even measure that?
You use clever cognitive tests, often involving reaction time. Researchers would show Himba participants a grid of, say, 12 color tiles. 11 tiles would be one shade of green, and one tile would be a slightly different shade of green.
And the task is just to spot the odd one out, quickly.
Exactly. And when the two different shades of green fell into different linguistic categories in Himba, like one was Sarandu and the other was Dambu, the Himba speakers were significantly quicker and more accurate at spotting the difference.
Even if the actual perceptual difference was subtle.
Yes, even if it was a difference that English speakers, who just call both tiles green, really struggled to spot quickly. Their language highlighted that boundary for them.
But conversely, what about the blue-green distinction, since they have the broad Buru category?
Conversely, when shown a grid with mostly green tiles and one blue tile, a distinction that's incredibly easy and fast for English speakers, the Himba speakers were noticeably slower.
Because both colors could fall under their single broad category of Buru.
Precisely. It's not that they can't see the difference. Of course they can. But the language doesn't prime them to attend to that specific boundary in the same way English primes us.
So this is the critical mechanism of the weaker hypothesis, linguistic relativity in action.
Exactly. Their vocabulary doesn't change the physics of light waves or the biology of their eyes, but it directs their attention. By assigning a specific label, the brain seems to treat that category boundary as more salient, more important, influencing how quickly and accurately they perceive and categorize things near that boundary.
It's like an attentional bias, rooted in the lexicon you happen to speak.
You got it. It nudges perception.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so we've seen how vocabulary, the words we have, affects perception. But you mentioned earlier that the real silent power might lie deeper, in the structures we don't even notice. Grammar.
Absolutely. I think that's where things get even more profound. Moving past just the labels, let's look at the hidden hand of grammar or syntax. These deep structures might exude even stronger influences, precisely because they operate largely below the level of conscious awareness.
They're just the water we swim in.
Exactly. They silently embed assumptions about reality, about agency, time, space, and they organize our thoughts according to their own inescapable logical demands, whether we realize it or not.
And this is where we see how these structures can dictate really fundamental assumptions, like how we even conceive of space.
Right. In English, we mostly use a relative spatial system. Egocentric. It's relative to me, the speaker. The phone is to my left, the keys are behind me. We can be pretty vague, relying on the listener sharing our perspective.
Or we use landmarks relative to us, past the big tree.
But many languages around the world actually force speakers into an absolute spatial system, one based on fixed cardinal directions or geographic features, and they require this kind of precise encoding in almost every spatial description.
Which demands something quite different from the speaker's brain, doesn't it?
It demands that speakers maintain highly detailed, constantly updated mental maps of their surroundings, completely independent of their own body's orientation at any given moment.
And the prime example always cited here is Teltal, right? A Mayan language spoken down in Chiapas, Mexico.
That's a classic case study. Siltal speakers, when describing the location of almost anything, must specify its position relative to the overall gradient of the land. Is it uphill or downhill from the speaker? Or sometimes across or transverse?
And this is mandatory, even indoors, even if the ground is flat.
Yes, it's grammatically required. Even if they are standing inside a small, perfectly flat room, they still have to use the uphill hill frame based on the larger landscape outside. They're constantly implicitly orienting themselves using these fixed geographical references.
Wow. That grammatical requirement sounds like, like a massive cognitive burden compared to just saying, it's over there.
It might seem like a burden to us, but for them, it's just how you talk about space.
So what's the consequence? What happens in the brain when you have to constantly perform that orientation check?
The fascinating consequence is that Celtal speakers develop truly extraordinary, almost unconscious spatial awareness and navigational skills. Cognitive studies show they maintain precise mental maps of their surroundings using cardinal directions, or these fixed axes, a level of constant, absolute orientation that English speakers typically just don't possess unless specifically trained, like sailors or pilots.
So the grammatical constraint translates directly into a superior cognitive skill set in that domain.
Exactly. The language forces their attention toward global orientation, this absolute frame, rather than the egocentric self-relative positioning that English encourages. It's a powerful illustration of grammatical structure shaping a fundamental cognitive ability.
That's incredibly clear. And we see similar patterns influencing how we think about agency, responsibility, even blame, don't we?
We do. Think about English sentence structure again. It strongly emphasizes the individual actor, the agent. We usually require a subject who performs the action. John broke the vase.
Right. Someone has to be doing the verb.
And this constant emphasis on the agent seems to have cognitive effects. Studies involving memory for events, particularly accidental ones, show that English speakers are significantly more likely to remember who performed the action compared to speakers of languages that structure things differently. Our grammar pushes us to focus on the who.
Okay, so contrast that with a language like Spanish, which often uses constructions that seem to de-emphasize individual agency, especially for accidents.
Right. In Spanish, for an accidental event like a vase breaking, you're much more likely to hear a passive, reflexive construction. Se rompió el florero.
Which translates literally something like the vase broke itself or the vase got broken.
Exactly. The focus shifts immediately to the event itself, the change of state in the vase, rather than automatically pointing the finger at the individual actor who might have caused it. It allows for a description of the event without necessarily assigning blame in the grammar itself.
So the very structure of the sentence sets up a potentially different cultural default regarding accountability or how you even frame an accident.
It seems to create a linguistic predisposition, yes. These patterns, repeated thousands of times a day, may very well contribute to subtle cultural differences in how responsibility, blame, and even individual achievement are conceptualized and attributed. If your language constantly requires you to identify the culprit, your thought processes might be habitually geared toward finding causal agents.
Whereas if your language allows you to describe the event more neutrally, maybe your cognition focuses more on the outcome or the situation itself.
It's a plausible link between grammatical habit and cultural framing.
And this idea of grammar requiring certain information goes even deeper, sometimes into really unexpected areas like how we know things. Tell us about evidentiality.
Evidentiality. This is a fascinating grammatical feature found in many languages, though not really in English in a grammaticalized way. It's mandatory in languages like Tariana, spoken in the Amazon basin.
And what does it require?
Tariana grammar requires speakers to indicate the source of their knowledge in basically every statement they make. You have to attach a specific grammatical marker, like a suffix on the verb, that specifies how you came to know the information you're asserting.
You can't just say the chief is dancing.
Nope. You have to say something like, the chief is dancing visual, if you saw it yourself, or the chief is dancing auditory, if you heard the music, or the chief is dancing inferred, if you saw his footprints leading to the dance ground, or the chief is dancing reported, if someone told you.
Wow. So the source of the information, its reliability, essentially is structurally compulsory, baked into the grammar like tense is for us.
Exactly like tense. You can't form a grammatical sentence about a past or present event without specifying how you know it. There are usually several categories: direct sensory evidence, seeing, hearing, inference from results, inference from general knowledge, reported information, hearsay.
That is incredible. What does that do to a speaker's thinking, having to constantly tag their knowledge source?
Well, this constant grammatical requirement means Tarion speakers are always, maybe unconsciously, evaluating and encoding the reliability and the source of the information they receive or relay. It potentially ingrains a fundamentally different epistemological habit into their everyday thought processes.
They must approach knowledge and assertions with a different set of built-in critical filters than English speakers, who usually only bother to specify our source of knowledge if someone challenges us, right? How do you know that?
Precisely. For them, it's standard operating procedure, part of the basic grammar. It likely fosters a different default stance towards certainty and evidence.
Okay, so far we've touched on concrete vocabulary affecting perception and implicit grammar shaping spatial reasoning, agency, and even epistemology. But there's a third major way language seems to shape thought, perhaps even more pervasively, through conceptual metaphor.
Yes, this is the crucial work pioneered by cognitive scientists like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. Their big insight was that our reasoning about complex, abstract domains, things like time, love, arguments, ideas, relies heavily and systematically on metaphorical mappings.
Mappings from what?
From concrete embodied experiences. Things we understand directly through our physical interactions with the world, like motion, containment, balance, force, temperature.
And critically, they argued these metaphors aren't just, poetic flourishes or figures of speech we use for decoration.
Not at all. They argued these metaphors are fundamental organizational principles of thought itself. We don't just use them to talk about abstract concepts. We actually use these metaphorical structures to understand and reason about the concepts. The metaphor structures the abstract domain.
The classic example they used is the pervasive conceptual metaphor. Argument is war.
Right. Think about how we talk about arguments in English. Your claims are indefensible. You attack someone's weak points. You shoot down their ideas. You win or lose an argument. You might gain ground or have to retreat.
We structure the entire interaction using the language of combat.
And Lakoff and Johnson's point is that this isn't just talk. This metaphorical structure actually influences how we conduct arguments, what we see as legitimate moves, and what counts as success, often prioritizing winning over understanding or collaboration.
Okay, let's take another huge one you mentioned earlier. Time is money.
Yes, this one is so deeply embedded in English and many other capitalist or industrialized cultures that we barely even recognize it as a metaphor anymore. We treat time as if it were a finite, quantifiable, transferable resource, just like currency.
Absolutely. We talk about how we spend time, how we can save time, maybe invest time wisely, or feel that time can be wasted, lost, or gained.
We worry about running out of time, about being time poor or time bankrupt. We talk about buying time.
This pervasive linguistic framework, this metaphor, it must influence how we actually experience and value temporal duration, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It links time inextricably to economic effort, productivity, and scarcity. And its influence extends way beyond the individual level. It shapes entire social and economic systems built around efficiency, deadlines, hourly wages, and the monetization of time itself.
And if we look cross-linguistically, we find different languages employ different metaphors for time, leading to entirely different cognitive orientations towards it.
We do. We already mentioned that English generally conceives of the future as being in front of us and the past behind us. We look forward to upcoming events, and the past is behind us.
Which seems intuitive, right? We move forward through space.
It seems intuitive to us. But contrast that, again, with the Aymara speakers in the Andes of South America. Studies suggest they employ a fundamentally different spatial metaphor for time. They often reverse this mapping.
Reverse it? How?
For Aymara speakers, the past is conceptualized as being in front of them, while the future is conceptualized as being behind them.
That seems completely counterintuitive to our way of thinking. Why would the past be in front?
Well, think about it from their perspective. The past is what is known, what has been seen, what has already happened. It's visible, in a sense. You can look at it.
Okay.
The future, on the other hand, is unknown, unseen. You cannot perceive it directly. So logically, what's known and visible is in front, and what's unknown and invisible is behind.
And they actually gesture this way.
Reportedly, yes. Aymara speakers often gesture forward in front of their bodies when discussing past events and gesture backward, perhaps over their shoulder when discussing future events. This linguistic metaphor reflects and probably reinforces a very different relationship with history, memory, planning, and the unknown compared to our standard forward-looking English framework.
That's fascinating. And it's not just about time, is it? This idea that the dominant metaphors in a language can constrain or enable certain kinds of thinking.
Right. Think about science or philosophy. If your language habitually treats the mind as a kind of container, we get ideas into our heads, we try not to have an empty mind, we have a full mental load, that conceptual metaphor might subtly limit the types of theories that philosophers or psychologists in that linguistic tradition develop about consciousness.
It might steer them towards models emphasizing storage, capacity, and localization.
Plausibly, yes. Or think back to the argument is war metaphor. If that's the default way your language frames intellectual debate, it might make developing collaborative, non-confrontational models of discourse or knowledge building feel inherently less natural or obvious.
Whereas scientists or philosophers working in different linguistic traditions, maybe where arguments are framed metaphorically as, say, journeys or building structures or even dances.
They might find certain alternative theoretical approaches or methods more intuitive or plausible simply because the metaphorical resources readily available in their language point them in those directions. The language primes certain ways of conceptualizing the abstract.
This really leads us to the sharpest edge of the linguistic relativity argument, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The whole phenomenon of untranslatability.
Exactly. When we find concepts or words in one language that seem to resist perfect one-to-one translation into another, it strongly suggests that languages aren't just labeling the same universal human experiences with different tags.
It suggests they might actually make available, or at least culturally validate and highlight, different forms of human experience altogether. Different ways of feeling or perceiving.
And we see this most clearly, perhaps, in the realm of emotional vocabulary. Think about the famous German word Schadenfreude.
Right, taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. We all know what it means, but English just doesn't have a single neat word for it.
We have to use a whole phrase to describe it. And the argument isn't just that German has a convenient label, it's that the existence of that single recognized word might make German speakers more likely to notice, categorize, and perhaps even feel that specific constellation of emotions when they encounter it. The word captures it, validates it, makes it a distinct thing in their emotional landscape.
It carves out that specific feeling from the general mess of emotions.
It gives it conceptual reality. Similarly, consider the Portuguese word saudade.
Ah, yes, often described as this deep, profound, almost nostalgic longing.
Exactly. A longing for something or someone absent or lost, maybe a person, a place, a time, even an idealized past. It encompasses a kind of bittersweet melancholy, a yearning mixed with acceptance. It's a very distinctive emotional state.
And again, it sounds like a state that English speakers can certainly experience, but we tend to describe it using a whole cluster of related feelings: longing, nostalgia, melancholy, wistfulness.
Right. But because Portuguese has this single culturally central word, saudade, speakers often report that it's not just a description. It feels like a distinctive, unified emotional state that the word itself captures and makes accessible. It gives them a precise cultural and linguistic tool for recognizing, naming, and discussing that specific emotional valence. The word helps constitute the experience.
This principle seems like it would apply beyond emotions too, maybe to aesthetics or awareness.
Absolutely. Think about certain Japanese aesthetic concepts that are notoriously difficult to translate fully into English. Concepts like wabi-sabi.
Which is about finding beauty in, imperfection, impermanence, humility, the beauty of the worn, the weathered, the incomplete.
Exactly. Or mono no aware.
That's the pathos of transience, right? That sort of gentle, bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of things, the passing nature of beauty in life.
Precisely. Now, English struggles mightily to capture the nuances of these concepts concisely. We often need long explanations, entire essays, or philosophical discussions to unpack what those single terms evoke for a Japanese speaker familiar with the cultural context.
So the availability of these precise linguistic tools in Japanese may be a whole vocabulary for describing different kinds of silence, or the specific sound of rain on different surfaces. It increases the cultural salience, the shared understanding, and maybe even the personal accessibility of these subtle experiential states.
It makes them readily available concepts to think with. For Japanese speakers immersed in that culture, these can be everyday, accessible ways of perceiving beauty or feeling. For many English speakers, they might remain somewhat abstract philosophical ideas, harder to grasp intuitively without the linguistic handle.
And finally, maybe we can touch on how grammatical structures shape social cognition, how we perceive and navigate our social world.
Yes, this is another fascinating area. Consider languages that have elaborate systems of honorifics and politeness levels grammatically encoded. Languages like Japanese, Korean, Javanese.
Where you can't just say you or I, or even basic verbs like to eat in one standard way.
Exactly. The system requires you to choose among multiple forms depending on a complex calculation of the social context. The age, status, gender, in-group, out-group relationship of the person you're talking to, the person you're talking about, and your own position relative to them.
That sounds like a constant, intensive social calculation you have to perform before even opening your mouth.
It is. You have to constantly monitor the social landscape and your place within it to select the grammatically correct and socially appropriate forms. It's a powerful cognitive workout in social awareness.
So what's the likely cognitive implication of having this social assessment hardwired into your grammar?
The hypothesis is that this constant mandatory process of assessing social hierarchy, distance, and context may lead to the development of much more sophisticated, rapid, fine-grained, and maybe even more automatic social cognition compared to speakers of languages like English, which lack such pervasive grammatical requirements for encoding social relationships.
Our social markers are mostly optional in vocabulary or tone, not usually baked into the core grammar.
Right. So speakers of these honorific-rich languages are structurally required by their grammar to be perpetually aware of social context in a way that we simply are not. It likely trains their social perception differently from the ground up.
It's quite amazing how deep this goes. Now, this ancient relationship between language and thought, it feels like it's taken on a whole new urgency in our digital age, hasn't it?
It really has. These new communication media are evolving incredibly rapidly, and they're creating novel linguistic structures and constraints that might be fundamentally altering human consciousness, maybe faster than ever before.
It's a fascinating point that constraint often drives linguistic evolution. Think about the early days of text messaging, the strict 160-character limit on SMS messages.
Absolutely. That technical constraint forced the development of entirely new, extremely abbreviated, efficiency-driven writing styles, text speak, leet speak, all those acronyms and omissions.
And you're suggesting this went beyond just a technical adaptation. It might have influenced thinking styles.
Plausibly, yes. If you're constantly forced to condense complex ideas into tiny windows, you might start prioritizing compressed, fragmentary modes of thought over, say, linear elaboration, nuance, or complex rhetorical structure. Brevity becomes the default mode.
And microblogging platforms like Twitter back in the day, or similar snippet-based communication channels, they seem to reinforce that tendency, don't they? Fragmented attention, condensed expression.
They absolutely do. They reward conciseness and immediate impact, which can shape how we formulate and even value ideas. Nuance can be harder to convey, or less likely to get attention.
The digital platforms themselves also introduce entirely new grammatical elements through their design, their affordances, the way they require us to interact. Take the hashtag, for instance.
The hashtag is a brilliant example. It creates a completely new form of categorical, networked thinking that bypasses traditional sentence grammar entirely. It allows users to instantly tag concepts, ideas, or topics, creating this spontaneous user-generated cross-reference taxonomy of information.
It's like a way of thinking categorically, of linking ideas without needing to compose a full, grammatically structured sentence about the connection.
Precisely. It fosters a kind of associative, networked linking of concepts. And think about the like button or similar reaction buttons.
Yeah, that's become a ubiquitous, minimal social response. It often replaces complex verbal feedback or commentary entirely.
It introduces a form of digital paralinguistic punctuation, a minimal affirmation or acknowledgement that shapes the flow of online conversation and how we process social information and validation.
And we can't ignore the role of algorithmic curation in all this, can we?
No, that's huge. The information we see online is increasingly filtered and customized based on our past behavior, our clicks, our likes. This creates powerful feedback loops.
Echo chambers.
Exactly. These algorithms reinforce certain patterns of thought, certain terminologies, certain viewpoints, simply by showing us more of what we've already engaged with. They can inadvertently narrow our exposure to alternative perspectives or different ways of framing issues, subtly shaping our linguistic and conceptual diet. The delivery system itself reinforces the language we use.
And we're also seeing this fascinating resurgence, or maybe a new evolution, of visual language, particularly emojis.
Yes. The rise of the emoji is, in some ways, a partial return to pictographic communication. They supplement and sometimes entirely replace nuanced verbal expression, especially for emotional tone or reaction.
What are the potential cognitive implications of this visual shift? Using little pictures instead of words.
Well, it's likely complex. On one hand, it might strengthen visual spatial thinking skills, particularly around recognizing and conveying emotional cues quickly and non-verbally. Emojis can add emotional context that's hard to get from plain text.
But on the other hand,
an over-reliance on emojis might potentially alter the role or diminish the practice of nuanced verbal analytical processing, especially in younger generations growing up with emojis as a completely native part of their communication toolkit. We might be seeing a new balance emerge between rapid visual emotional transfer and slower, more deliberate, nuanced verbal expression and analysis.
A different kind of literacy developing. Now, if language truly shapes consciousness in these ways, studying people who speak multiple languages, bilinguals, and polyglots should give us some really powerful insights, shouldn't it?
It absolutely does. And the research here is fascinating. Bilingual individuals don't just possess multiple vocabularies and grammars. They often report subjectively feeling different, almost like having different personalities, or exhibiting different emotional responses and cognitive styles when they're operating in their different languages.
That's amazing. The idea that switching languages can actually switch aspects of yourself.
It strongly suggests that language can activate different cultural frames, different sets of assumptions, values, and associated behaviors that have become deeply interwoven with that specific linguistic system through experience. It's called frame switching.
Can you give us a concrete example of that kind of frame switching in action?
Sure. There have been studies, for instance, showing that Spanish-English bilinguals might behave more assertively or perhaps make more individualistic or even more risk-averse economic decisions when tested while speaking English.
Reflecting cultural values often associated more strongly with Anglo-American culture, perhaps.
Possibly, yes. Values embedded in or associated with the linguistic system that privileges individualism. Conversely, the same individuals might revert to more communal, relational, or perhaps more formal interaction patterns when tested while speaking Spanish, reflecting different cultural norms potentially linked to that language.
And we see this influence even on core cognitive concepts like time, again, right, with Mandarin English bilinguals.
Yes, that's another classic finding. Mandarin often uses vertical metaphors for time sequence. Earlier events are up, later events are down. English strongly prefers horizontal metaphors. The past is back, the future is forward.
So what happens with bilinguals?
Studies show that Mandarin English bilinguals, when they are primed by thinking or speaking in Mandarin, tend to show faster reaction times or greater accuracy when dealing with vertically arranged temporal information. But if you prime the same individuals by having them think or speak in English, they immediately perform better with horizontally arranged temporal information.
Their cognitive orientation towards time literally shifts depending on which language is active in their mind at that moment.
Exactly. The active language primes a different conceptual metaphor, a different way of organizing that abstract domain.
Beyond this intriguing frame switching, are there more general cognitive benefits associated with multilingualism?
Oh yes, the cognitive benefits are very well documented now. The constant mental juggling involved in managing two or more languages seems to strengthen the brain's general control mechanisms.
What specifically gets strengthened?
What scientists call executive functions or executive control. This is the brain's high-level system responsible for things like focusing attention, ignoring distractions, switching flexibly between tasks, and holding information in working memory.
So learning and using multiple languages isn't just about adding vocabulary. It's like taking your brain's control center to the gym.
That's a great analogy. The constant need to select the appropriate language and, crucially, to suppress the interference from the non-target language or languages provides continuous training for these general cognitive control mechanisms.
Which leads to?
Multilingual individuals, on average, frequently demonstrate enhanced attention management skills, better problem-solving abilities involving conflicting information, and overall greater cognitive flexibility compared to monolinguals, especially as they age. It seems to build cognitive reserve.
And this training effect might explain that intriguing phenomenon some multilinguals report memory compartmentalization.
Yes, that's related. Some bilinguals or polyglots describe feeling that certain thoughts, memories, or particularly emotions are somehow more accessible, or only truly feel right when experienced or expressed in a specific language.
Like childhood memories might feel stronger in their first language.
Exactly. Or maybe professional concepts feel more natural in the language they use for work. A Polish-English bilingual, for example, might find they can only fully connect with the complex emotions surrounding a specific traumatic event from their childhood when thinking or speaking in Polish, while discussing abstract scientific concepts flows much more easily in English.
So languages might act almost like retrieval cues, like keys unlocking different cultural contexts, emotional registers, or compartments of the self and memory.
That's a compelling way to think about it. Language seems deeply tied not just to thought, but to the organization and accessibility of our experiences and our sense of self across different life domains.
We're starting to get glimpses of the biological underpinnings of all this now, too, with modern neuroscience, aren't we? Peering into the brain itself.
We are. Brain imaging studies using fMRI and EEG are revealing more about how language processing is physically instantiated in the brain and how it might differ across languages.
And what are they finding?
Well, for one thing, they're confirming that different languages don't necessarily use the exact same neural real estate. While there are core language areas like Broca's and Wernicke's areas, the specific networks activated can vary. This implies that linguistic diversity might actually correspond to some level of genuine neurological diversity in how brains are wired for language.
Can you give an example of that neurological diversity?
A really clear example comes from comparing tonal languages like Mandarin Chinese with non-tonal languages like English. In Mandarin, the pitch contour, the tone of a syllable, is crucial for distinguishing word meaning. A ma said with a high flat tone means mother, but with a falling then rising tone means horse.
So pitch isn't just emotional inflection, it's part of the word itself.
Exactly. And brain imaging shows that native speakers of Mandarin, when processing their language, show significantly enhanced involvement of brain areas typically associated with musical pitch processing, often in the right hemisphere, compared to speakers of non-tonal languages, where language processing tends to be more strongly lateralized to the left hemisphere.
Their brains are literally processing language, using partly different neural machinery because of the structure of the language they learned.
It appears so, and this observation strongly supports the idea of a critical period hypothesis for language acquisition.
The idea that learning a language early in life is different from learning it later.
Yes. It seems that early linguistic exposure, probably before puberty, permanently shapes the neural architecture for language in ways that learning later in life doesn't quite replicate. Adult language learners typically retain foreign accents, which reflects less native-like motor control, but they also often show different, sometimes less efficient or more widely distributed patterns of brain activation when processing their second language.
Suggesting that the linguistic environment you grow up in lays down lasting foundations, maybe even constraints, on how your brain organizes itself for cognitive processing, particularly language.
That seems to be the case. Early learning tunes the brain in specific ways.
We also gain some tragic but valuable insights from the opposite situation. Language loss due to brain damage, like in aphasia.
Yes, studying aphasia provides compelling evidence for the deep intertwinement of language and thought. When specific language functions are lost due to stroke or injury, we often see corresponding changes or deficits in non-linguistic thinking abilities as well.
It's not just an output problem, then.
Often no. For instance, patients suffering from certain types of aphasia, like Wernicke's aphasia, where language comprehension is severely impaired, they can speak fluently, but it's often nonsensical word salad. These patients frequently also struggle with nonverbal tasks that require conceptual categorization or sorting objects based on meaning, even if their visual perception is perfectly intact.
So losing the language tool seems to impair the underlying conceptual ability.
It strongly suggests that language isn't just a communication layer added on top of thought. It seems to provide a critical organizational framework, a scaffolding for many abstract concepts and types of reasoning. Linguistic deficits can cascade into broader cognitive impairments, demonstrating how tightly language and certain kinds of thinking are bound together in the brain.
This deep intertwinement brings us circling back, in a way, to the philosophy of language, doesn't it? To thinkers like Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Absolutely. Wittgenstein, particularly in his later work, famously argued that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world.
Ooh, which sounds like linguistic determinism again, but maybe he meant something more subtle.
I think he did. He moved beyond the simple idea that language is just a system for representing a pre-existing reality. Wittgenstein suggested that language constitutes what he called forms of life, complex, rule-governed activities embedded in social practices. Learning a language isn't just learning words, it's learning how to participate in these forms of life.
Like learning a language game of science or religion or promising or telling jokes.
Exactly. And these language games, these forms of life, don't just describe reality. They make certain experiences, assumptions, ways of reasoning, and even certain kinds of facts possible and meaningful within that specific context, while making others difficult or impossible to even conceive. If you don't participate in the language game of science, for instance, the entire conceptual reality of scientific evidence and facts might remain inaccessible or nonsensical to you.
So this raises a pretty radical implication for communication across different cultures or linguistic communities, doesn't it? If they inhabit genuinely different forms of life, different conceptual realities structured by their languages.
Yeah.
How is accurate translation or deep understanding even possible?
It's a huge challenge. Wittgenstein suggested that bridging these differences requires far more than just looking up words in a dictionary or finding grammatical equivalents. It requires something like empathetic participation in the other culture's language games.
You have to learn to see the world, at least partially, through the linguistic and cultural eyes of the other community. Understand the entire way of being that underpins their use of words.
That's the idea. True understanding requires grasping the underlying form of life, not just translating the surface structure. It's about learning to play their game.
Now, we also need to acknowledge, impartially of course, how these linguistic differences interact with social and political realities. The specific language or dialect we speak, the accent we carry, these aren't just neutral variations, are they?
Not in the social world, no. These linguistic markers become heavily overlaid with social judgments about intelligence, competence, trustworthiness, and social status.
And it's crucial to emphasize that these judgments are purely social constructs, right? Not based on any inherent linguistic superiority or inferiority.
Absolutely critical. From a purely linguistic standpoint, all languages and dialects are equally complex, systematic, and rule-governed systems capable of expressing any human thought. There's no such thing as a primitive language linguistically. Yet, societies inevitably elevate certain standard varieties, often those associated with political power or education, while stigmatizing non-standard varieties or minority languages.
And this linguistic prejudice reinforces existing social hierarchies, doesn't it? It can limit educational and economic opportunities based purely on how someone speaks, often tied to their region, ethnicity, or social class.
It's a major mechanism for maintaining social inequality, often operating subtly but powerfully.
Furthermore, when we look globally, the dominance of certain languages, often linked to historical colonialism or current economic power, sometimes called linguistic imperialism, has led to the endangerment and loss of thousands of indigenous languages around the world.
And this loss is not just a matter of cultural impoverishment, losing songs or stories.
No, based on everything we've discussed, it's much deeper than that, isn't it?
It is arguably the disappearance of unique forms of human consciousness. Each language that dies takes with it a unique, possibly irreplaceable way of structuring reality, organizing knowledge, conceptualizing the world, and relating to the environment, often built up over millennia. We're losing entire experiments in how the human mind can make sense of existence.
Which presents a really difficult ongoing policy challenge for many nations and communities, trying to balance the preservation of this invaluable linguistic and cognitive diversity against the undeniable pressures and perceived economic advantages of adopting dominant global languages.
It's a complex trade-off with profound implications for cultural identity and the richness of human thought.
And now, looking ahead, we face this entirely new frontier where human cognition is increasingly being intertwined with and augmented by machine processing, AI.
Yes, this is creating a kind of hybrid thinking. We have AI assistants, sophisticated translation software, predictive text algorithms. These tools don't just passively assist our thinking, they actively shape the vocabulary available to us, the style of our writing, the patterns of our thought, in subtle but potentially significant ways.
Think about the fundamental shift that search engines have brought about in how we relate to knowledge.
It's huge. When almost any piece of factual information is instantly accessible via a quick search, the cognitive value, the necessity of internalizing and storing large amounts of information in our own biological memory potentially decreases.
We rely less on deeply memorized, stored knowledge, and maybe more on knowing how to find information efficiently. Metacognitive skills about search strategies.
Exactly. This transition from a primarily storage-based cognitive economy to a more access-based one might represent a truly fundamental change in how human memory and even understanding operate. Our metacognition shifts from what do I know towards where can I look that up quickly and effectively.
It's outsourcing part of our memory.
In a sense, yes, and we also have to be really mindful of the dangers inherent in the current generation of large language models, the AIs that power chatbots and other tools.
How so?
While these systems are trained by analyzing massive data sets of existing human language text and conversations scraped from the internet, books, articles, by their very nature, they learn by identifying statistical patterns, correlations, and biases present in that human-generated data.
So if the human language data they're trained on contains societal biases, sexism, racism, stereotypes,
then the machine learning system will inevitably learn, reproduce, and potentially even amplify those existing linguistic biases simply because they are statistically prevalent patterns in the input data.
the AI isn't necessarily biased itself, but it reflects the biases embedded in our language back at us.
Precisely. For example, if the training data consistently shows a statistical correlation between certain professions, like engineer or programmer, and male pronouns or names, and others like nurse or teacher with female pronouns, the AI system will likely perpetuate or even exaggerate those stereotypes in its own output.
It encodes and reinforces prejudices already embedded in our collective language use, potentially solidifying them into the future fabric of digital communication.
Yes, the AI doesn't invent the bias, it simply operationalizes the linguistic statistics it was fed, biases and all. This is a major ethical and technical challenge.
So after this journey exploring everything from, hypothesized Hopi concepts of time, to the color perception of the himba, to Spanish grammar and agency, to Japanese aesthetics, to digital hashtags, and now AI biases, what's the big takeaway?
I think the evidence from all these diverse angles converges pretty clearly. The linguistic systems we inherit and use profoundly influence our cognitive processes. They shape our attention, they structure our categorization, they guide our reasoning, they organize our conceptual understanding of abstract domains.
And they do this at multiple levels,
Right.
Not just vocabulary.
Right. From the lexicon, the words we have, through the implicit rules of grammar and syntax, all the way to the pervasive conceptual metaphors that structure our understanding of things like time, emotion, and argument. Linguistic diversity isn't just different ways of talking. It's a vast natural experiment in different ways of being conscious, different ways of constructing reality.
Understanding how language shapes your reality, your thought processes, it isn't just academic then. It offers some real practical wisdom, doesn't it?
How about this?
Deep, often invisible structures governing human experience.
I think so. The next time you choose a word or phrase something in a particular way, maybe pause for just a second and consider the entire conceptual framework, the cultural baggage, the attentional focus, the cognitive pathway that single word or grammatical structure might carry with it. It's powerful stuff.
And as these new technological forms of language continue to emerge, communication increasingly mediated by code, algorithms, AI, and the boundary between human language and machine language potentially blurs, it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it?
It does. We should ask ourselves, what novel forms of consciousness, what new ways of thinking might be emerging right now that perhaps transcend the constraints and possibilities of traditional human grammar as we've known it?
If we increasingly outsource aspects of our memory, our calculation, our synthesis of information to these powerful technologies, are we evolving into a fundamentally new type of hybrid intelligence? And perhaps more importantly,
What new reality, what new form of life with its own limits and potentials are we unintentionally building for ourselves and future generations through the very structure of this emerging algorithmic code and digital language?